Hey everyone! Welcome back to Strange Minds 6. I'm your host, Ruby, and today we're going to be getting back into Rebels and Revolutions Real Tales of Radical Change in America by Judy Dodge Cummings. But before we begin, please grab your snack, grab your drink, or sit back and relax, and let's get to it. Chapter 5 Viva La Causa. 12-year-old Cesar Chavez stood rooted to the soil of what had been, until a few days ago, his family farm. It was February 1939, the height of the Great Depression. Cesar's parents had been unable to pay the taxes on their land in the Gila Valley of Arizona, so the state sold their ranch to the highest bidder. Cesar's father loaded their belongings into the family station wagon, and Cesar's mother wept. The day his family lost their land was the day rebellion was born in the heart of Cesar Chavez. His grandfather fled poverty in Mexico in the 1880s and homesteaded 100 acres in Arizona just over the California border. Cesar's father, Librado Chavez, also farmed the land, growing cotton, watermelon, and alfalfa. He opened a grocery store and pool hall in the valley. Although Cesar's childhood home did not have indoor plumbing or electricity, the family made ends meet. Then the stock market crashed in 1929, and the nation plummeted into a decade-long depression. In 1933, a drought struck. Soon, the Chavez family could not pay its bills. The family joined hordes of other landless farmers heading to California to work in the agricultural industry. California agriculture began in the 1860s. White men purchased large tracts of land to grow fruit, nuts, and vegetables. They needed labor to work these fields and turned to the cheapest source available: immigrants. First, the Chinese, then Filipino and Japanese workers toiled in the fields. In the early 1900s, 1 million Mexicans joined them. When the Chavez family arrived in California, they had to compete for work with 300,000 other desperate farm laborers. As migrant workers, the Chavez family traveled up and down California to follow the seasons of the crops. They would spend 2 weeks on one farm harvesting watermelon, and then 2 months on another farm picking grapes. Some migrant workers rented rooms, some slept in tents, and many lived in huge camps run by labor contractors. There was money to be made in the California fields, but these profits did not trickle down to migrant workers such as Caesar and his family. The white landowners, called growers, paid labor contractors a fee to hire migrant workers for planting and harvesting. The contractors charged the workers rent to live in the labor camps. The growers paid the migrant workers an hourly wage and set an amount based on how many rows a worker planted or harvested. But the growers could charge the wages they paid whenever they wanted, and they often did. In a barrio of San Jose, called Sal si puedes, Caesar and 10 other people slept in a 10 by 12-foot room, a broken down garage with a dirt floor served as the kitchen. Caesar's mother, Juana, cooked over an old bathtub that she filled with firewood and covered with a grill. The Chavezes struggled to put food on the table. Whenever they moved for work, the Chavez children went to school and worked in the fields on weekends and holidays. Caesar and his younger brother, Richard, also worked odd jobs. They ran errands for people, shelled walnuts, and collected foil from cigarette wrappers to sell to the junk man. The boys turned over every cent to their mother. Caesar's skin color and Mexican heritage made him a target. One day, Caesar went into a cafe and ordered a hamburger. The waitress laughed and said, "We don't sell to Mexicans." The movie theater in the city of Delano was segregated. In 1944, Caesar sat in the whites-only section. The police were called and Caesar was hauled to the station and lectured. Juana Chavez had never learned to read and write, but insisted all 5 of her children attend school. But Caesar hated it. Caesar said later, "We were like monkeys in a cage." Whenever any of the Mexican-American children spoke Spanish, teachers forced them to run laps or write, "I won't speak Spanish," on the board hundreds of times. That sounds like what's going on nowadays. Sorry. It's the truth, you guys. It really is. But continuing with the story. One teacher even hung a sign around Caesar's neck with the words, "I am a clown, I speak Spanish." The cruelty of the students was even more painful. Caesar had one good shirt for school. He wore this same gray t-shirt every day and washed it each night. The other students ridiculed him for never changing his clothes, but Caesar never lashed out. Juana raised her children to be nonviolent. She was famous in the family for her dichos, or sayings. One of her favorites was, "It takes 2 to fight, and one can't do it alone." Caesar took this philosophy to heart. During his 8 years of formal education, Caesar attended 37 different schools. When he graduated from 8th grade in June 1942, Caesar dropped out. He was only 15 years old when he went into the fields to work full-time. The life of a migrant laborer was hard and humiliating. Supervisors insulted and intimidated workers. There was no drinking water or bathrooms in the fields, so people went behind bushes when they could find them. Pesticides were sprayed over the fields while the workers bent over the crops. Sometimes the pay was so low and working conditions so bad that workers went on strike. Liberado Chavez joined a few labor unions when Caesar was a teenager. A union is an organization made up of workers in a particular field. The workers negotiate as one united voice, which gives them more power. The most powerful weapon a union has is a strike. When Librado heard the word "ulga" strike, he and his kids walked off the fields. But growers defeated every union that tried to win a contract to represent migrant workers. Growers brought in strike breakers called scabs. There were always workers who were willing to work for lower wages than union was demanding. Caesar was desperate to find a way out of this hard scrabble life, but found himself with many mouths to feed. In 1948, he married Helen Fabela, and the couple eventually had 8 children. Caesar believed the only way to escape the poverty of a migrant worker's life was to help his children get an education. Then he met some men who helped him envision another option. Caesar and Helen settled in Sal Si Puedes, where Caesar found a job stacking lumber. One day he met Father Donald McDonald, a priest who conducted services in a little shack he was trying to turn into a church. Caesar helped out by painting benches and doing carpentry. McDonald talked to Caesar about economics. Farm laborers earned a few dollars a day. They lived in tents or shacks and fed their kids a diet of beans, fried dough, dandelion greens, and potatoes. The growers lived in mansions, drove expensive cars. They fed their children steak and the fresh vegetables and fruit that migrant workers picked but could not afford to buy. MacDonald gave Caesar books about Gandhi, the Indian activist whose nonviolent resistance pushed Great Britain to give India its independence. Caesar learned about the federal laws that protected all American workers, except farm laborers. Father MacDonald opened Caesar's mind to the possibility of social change. One evening in June 1952, a stranger knocked on Caesar's door. Fred Ross ran a group called the Community Service Organization, CSO, whose mission was to help Mexican Americans. The CSO registered Mexican Americans to vote, taught English classes, and filed discrimination claims for people who had been mistreated. Ross had worked with people in Los Angeles and wanted to expand into San Jose, where many Mexican Americans lived. Would Caesar hold a meeting at his house the next night? "How many people do you want?" Caesar asked. "About 4 or 5, Ross said. "How about 20? Caesar said. Ross was delighted. The next night, 20 people packed into Caesar and Helen's little house. Ross spoke about the struggles Caesar and his neighbors faced and how much power poor people could have if they united. Caesar began crisscrossing California for the CSO. He organized English classes and citizenship classes. He translated for people, wrote their complaint letters, and helped them navigate legal troubles. In 1958, the CSO hired Caesar as its national director. As he met with poor Mexican Americans in one community after another, Caesar heard a common complaint: "We want jobs." Labor contractors and growers were violating the law by hiring braceros, Mexican farm workers, instead of American citizens, to plant and harvest their crops. This was illegal. Braceros could be fired braceros could be hired only in areas where there was a shortage of American workers. That was not the case in California, but the growers preferred to hire braceros because they could pay them less. Caesar decided to test the growers' hiring system to expose their law breaking. In Oxnard, there was a large bracero labor camp. Caesar showed up at the crack of dawn one morning to apply for a job in the fields. The labor contractor told him to fill out his application at the farm placement service, 8 miles away. Caesar did and was given a work registration card, which he took back to the bracero camp. "Sorry," the man at the camp said, "all the jobs have been filled today." Caesar learned the camp sent their braceros to the fields at 4:30 a.m. By 6, all work for the day had been assigned. So he tried a different approach. The next day, he arrived at the bracero camp at 5 a.m. with his registration card from the day before in hand. "Sorry," the labor contractor said, "I can't accept this registration. It's dated for yesterday." It was time to organize. Caesar started to take others with him to the farm placement office to apply for work. At first, only 2 or 3 people accompanied him, but within a month, 100 to 200 migrant workers were applying for work every day. They formed a line outside the farm placement office with Caesar at the head. When he shouted, "March," they filed inside and marched past the secretaries to the employment office in the back room. The application form was designed to frustrate and confuse. An applicant had to recount his employment history going back 20 years, but Caesar talked the migrant workers through the form. Caesar also tried a more visible tactic. Migrant workers picketed the braceros' camp every evening, shouting, "We want jobs." When the U.S. Secretary of Labor spoke to businessmen in Oxnard, 1,000 migrant workers stood outside the building with signs that read, "We want jobs." Caesar's tactics worked. The federal government began to investigate the growers' use of the bracero program. About 13 months after this battle began, growers agreed to hire migrant workers instead of braceros, and they boosted wages from 60 to 90 cents per hour. Caesar knew this victory would be short-lived. He had organized thousands of people for a common goal, but there was no permanent structure in place to safeguard these hard-earned gains once he left the area. Caesar's prediction came true. 6 months later, braceros filled the fields around Oxnard again. Migrant workers needed their own labor union. Only with a labor union could their interests be represented by a permanent group with the power to negotiate wages and working conditions. Growers could not be allowed to change the rules whenever they felt like it. Caesar tried to persuade the rest of the CSO to support his vision. At the CSO convention in 1962, delegates voted on whether the organization should work to create a migrant workers' union. The no votes won. Caesar was there with Fred Ross and another farm activist named Dolores Huerta. Ross and Huerta both wept, but Caesar had another strategy. At the convention, as it was ending, he stood, "I have another announcement to make. Caesar paused and then dropped the bombshell. I resign. The crowd was stunned. People begged him to reconsider, but Caesar refused. I'm gonna start my own union, he told Huerta. She thought he was out of his mind. Caesar was only one man. He had no money. Building a migrant workers' union was a monumental task, but Huerta could not get Caesar's dream out of her head. Migrant workers needed a union. Caesar had the passion, and maybe that would help him succeed where other efforts had failed. Huerta quit the CSO, too, and became Caesar's partner. When Caesar quit the CSO, he and Helen had 8 children, $1,200, and no jobs. But Helen shared her husband's dream. They moved back to Delano and got to work. Helen went to work in the fields. She rose at 4 in the morning, prepared her children's breakfasts and lunches, and then worked for 10 hours for 85 cents an hour. When Helen planted and picked, Caesar organized. He went door to door across California's agricultural sector, explaining how a union could help migrant workers. Dolores Huerta, Reverend Jim Drake, and Caesar's cousin Manuel helped him recruit union members. House by house, town by town, people joined the movement. A mere 20 people became 30, and then 75. Caesar named the union National Farm Workers Association and scheduled its first convention. Delegates gathered on September 30th, 1962, in an abandoned theater in Delano. Manuel had designed a Union flag. It hung in the auditorium, a black eagle in the center of a white circle on a bright red background. They adopted a series of goals: enroll migrant workers across the state into the Union, negotiate contracts with growers, lobby for a minimum wage. They also adopted the motto, Viva La Causa, long live the cause. The morning of September 8th, 1965, Filipino grape workers in Delano went on strike. They were represented by their own union, the Agriculture Workers Organization Committee, which had demanded a raise from $1.25 an hour to $1.40 an hour. The growers had refused. Word of the strike spread among the Mexican-American grape pickers. Workers streamed into Caesar's office all day asking what they should do. Caesar scheduled a union meeting for September 16th so members would vote on whether or not to join the Filipinos in strike. On the evening of September 16th, hundreds of farm workers crowded into a Delano church. Many were dirty and tired from a day in the vineyards. Caesar rose to speak, reminding the audience that on September 16th in 1810, the Mexican Revolution had begun. He told the crowd that the workers would defeat the growers just as Mexicans overthrew the Spanish. It was time to vote. Strike or no strike? The farm workers' response shook the church walls. Viva la huelga! Long live the strike! Viva la causa! Long live the cause! Viva Cesar Chavez! Long live Cesar Chavez! The people had spoken, and their leader would support their decision, but he insisted members vote on one more issue. Would the strike remain nonviolent? Caesar still carried the details of his mother. La Causa would not succeed if hatred and revenge became the Union's weapons. Members agreed. No violence. At 4:30 the next morning, Filipino Americans and Mexican Americans joined forces for the first time. Strikers formed picket lines along the road outside the vineyards and carried signs that said "Huelga" or strike. They stood on top of cars and shouted through megaphones, trying to convince workers in the field to join them. Strikebreakers were bussed in from far away as Texas. Growers blasted music from car speakers to drown out the strikers' chants. Farm supervisors ran trucks past the picket lines to stir up clouds of dust. Growers unleashed dogs on strikers and sprayed pesticides in their direction. Some even shot bullets over the strikers' heads. In keeping with their pledge of nonviolence, union members did not retaliate. The police sided with the growers. Every person on the picket line was photographed by an officer. Caesar and the other union leaders were followed by law enforcement every time they left home. Rallies were held every night to keep strikers motivated. Caesar told the people, if we can keep our great strike peaceful, nonviolent, and strong, we cannot lose. But 2 weeks passed, then 3. The grapes were being harvested, and the growers showed no signs of relenting. Caesar wanted to gain more attention. Then the county sheriff warned picketers that shouting "Huelga" was illegal because the noise interference with business. Caesar got an idea. He gathered together a group of women and ministers who were willing to spend a few nights in jail. On October 19th, 44 Union volunteers, including Helen Chavez, Caesar's wife, gathered outside a ranch in Delano and shouted "Huelga" as loud as they could. The protesters were arrested and charged with disturbing the peace and unlawful assembly. When word of the arrest reached Caesar, he was just about to give a speech to 500 university students. Caesar told them what happened and asked if they would donate their lunch money to bail the strikers out. By the end of the day, the union had collected 6,700 $1 bills, and the sheriff's department had received 100 telegrams and 300 phone calls of protest. Although the strike was gaining attention, the growers did not back down. People became desperate as their bills mounted up. Some strikers found jobs in other crops or returned to their former employers. Tension grew as families and friends faced each other across the increasingly thin picket line. The strike seemed doomed. Caesar wrote to clergy and civil rights groups and student organizations. He pleaded with them to help the struggling migrant workers. If they could donate money, that was great, but what he really needed was volunteers to join the fight. He offered 3 meals a day and a floor to sleep on. The appeal worked. College students, hippies, civil rights activists, ministers, and nuns all flocked to Delano. This melding of cultures, races, and social classes was proof that a revolution was in the air. Caesar put these volunteers to work implementing his new strategy, the boycott. Fall had arrived. Grapes were gone from the fields, but were still in stores. The union needed to convince people to stop buying them. Shenley Liquor Company owned a small vineyard near Delano. The union sent word across the country to help striking migrant workers in California. Do not buy Shenley products. Next, the boycott expanded to table grapes. Volunteers tailed trucks as they left Delano vineyards, and picket lines were set up along the drivers' routes. These pickets caused delays and sometimes blocked the delivery of grapes completely. Members of the Longshoremen's Union refused to cross the migrant workers' picket lines to load crates on ships. Fruit destined for Asia rotted on the docks. People in power began to pay attention. Democrats in Congress wanted to amend the National Labor Relations Act. This law protected the right of workers to form labor unions, but excluded farm laborers from these protections. In March 1966, public hearings on the proposed change were scheduled in California. Robert F. Kennedy, a young senator from New York, was invited to attend. Robert F. Kennedy was the brother of U.S. President John F. Kennedy, who had been assassinated in 1963. Union officials told Kennedy that 30 strikers had just been arrested because scabs had threatened to hurt them. Before the hearing broke for lunch, Kennedy quizzed Kern County Sheriff Leroy Gallon. "What did you arrest them for?" Kennedy asked. The sheriff said the scabs said, "If you don't get them, the strikers, out of here, we're going to cut their hearts out." Kennedy frowned. "How can you go arrest somebody if they haven't violated the law?" "They're ready to violate the law," the sheriff said. The crowd roared with laughter, and Kennedy suggested that during the lunch break, the sheriff should read the U.S. Constitution. This was a powerful, symbolic moment for the migrant workers' struggle. An influential senator was publicly ridiculing a local sheriff for his support of big growers. Someone in power was finally on the side of the workers. Union organizers got word that the California Fair Trade Act had been passed by the California legislature. This law gave growers a guaranteed minimum price for their wine, but the men and women who picked the grapes to make that wine were not guaranteed a minimum wage. Caesar decided the strikers would make a pilgrimage to the place of power. They would march from Delano to the state capital of Sacramento, 300 miles away, through 33 cities. The morning of March 17th, 50 men set off from Delano, sleeping bags slung over their shoulders. Mile after mile, they marched through towns and cities and past fields of cotton and citrus. From a distance, a serpentine line of strikers stretched along the valley. Red Union flags silhouetted on a blue sky. People lined the road and cheered the men on. And each evening, as they straggled into a new town, the marchers were greeted with dinner and a rally. But in some communities, the marchers walked by homes with tables in the yards covered in fancy linens. Signs on the tables read, "We use Shenley products." Some drivers flashed marchers the finger as they zoomed past. At the end of the day, of marching, Caesar's feet were covered in blisters, and his right ankle, swelled the size of a melon. The next day, the swelling reached his thigh, and he shook with fever. Forced to ride for a couple of days, he resumed the march with a cane, but admitted every step was a needle. The men entered Stockton 18 days into the march. They were joined by 5,000 people. Mariachi bands played, and specters draped the marchers with flowers. That night, Shinli officials called Union officials. They wanted to deal. The next day, Caesar signed an agreement with Shinli. They recognized the union and promised to begin negotiating wages within 60 days on Easter Sunday. More than 8,000 farm workers and their supporters gathered in the park in front of the Capitol building in Sacramento. The farm workers may have won the battle, but the war was not over. A few growers followed Shinli's example and signed contracts with the union, but most still refused. The union shifted the boycott to DiGiorio, the largest grower in California, and one known for using violence against strikers. DiGiorio was a sneaky opponent to get around the grape boycott. The company borrowed the labels of other growers, so Caesar expanded the boycott. He appeared on daytime television to tell supporters to boycott all table grapes from California, any store, they were told. Volunteers fanned out across the country to implement this strategy. Priests knelt in produce aisles and prayed over grapes. Candlelight vigils were held outside the homes of supermarket executives whose stores sold California grapes. Boycotters stalled cars in the entries of stores where California produce lined the shelves. While the growers lost money, they still refused to give in. Frustrated among union members grew. People had been picketing in Delano for 2 years, and the grapes were still being picked and shipped. When a striker was run over by a truck driven by an angry grower, people wanted revenge. Strikers set fire to some water pumps and a grower's shed. The mood was ugly. Caesar was determined to bring everything to a halt until the violence stopped. His solution? A hunger strike. One day in February of 1968, Caesar stopped eating. After fasting for 4 days, Caesar called a meeting to tell the strikers what he was doing and why. I'm going to fast until everyone in the strike either ignores me or makes up their mind to be nonviolent, he said. Then he went to 40 acres, a shed that had been converted to Union headquarters. Caesar did not want to fast at home where Helen and his children would see him suffer. The Union Hall erupted after Caesar left as everyone bickered about who was to blame. But as days passed, the strikers began to unite. Caesar's actions had jolted people. Their dedication to the cause picked up. Their volunteering increased. Talk of violence ended. The first 7 days were torture. Caesar dreamed about food, but by the 8th day, lightness filled him. He did not need sleep, nor was he hungry. He buzzed with energy and his concentration was sharp. Then the pain began. 2 weeks into the fast, Caesar's back and joints began to throb. The calcium was leaching out of the bones. People streamed into 40 acres pleading with Caesar to eat. Finally, on March 11th, 25 days after it began, Caesar broke his fast at a mass with 4,000 supporters, including Senator Kennedy. The national media attended. Caesar was too weak to speak, but a friend read a message he had written. Our struggle is not easy. Those who oppose our cause are rich and powerful. We are poor, but we have our own bodies and spirits, and the justice of our cause as our weapons. By 1969, the grape boycott stretched across the nation. Great shipments to Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Toronto were completely shut down. Grapes rotted in warehouses. The growers had lost at least $25 million and were finally ready to deal. On June 29, 1970, 5 years after the strike began, 29 growers from Delano came to 40 acres to sign contracts with the union. They agreed to pay the workers $1.80 an hour and donate 10 cents an hour to the Robert Kennedy Health and Welfare Fund. All hiring would be done through the union rather than labor contractors. Workers would be protected from pesticide exposures. It was the most successful contract for farm workers in American history. When Caesar was asked why the UFWO had succeeded when so many other unions had failed, he said, "We set an example that we were not going to abandon the fight, that we were going to stay with the struggle if it took a lifetime, and we meant it." The contract with the grape growers did not end Caesar's work. He led a strike against lettuce growers in the 1980s when grape growers reneged on their commitments to protect workers from pesticide exposures. Caesar led an international boycott of California table grapes. In later years, the union faced internal strife and competition from other unions. It failed to secure contracts from many growers. Despite these troubles, Cesar Chavez remains one of America's greatest rebels for social change. His vision of La Causa altered the lives of all migrant workers and became a model of social change. The end. And I hope that everyone enjoyed this book. It was actually published by Nomad Press, Mystery and Mayhem. And it's actually a really, really good book. I definitely recommend it. If you ever go into like your local libraries, definitely check it out. It's really good. But as always, my dear friends, may you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, or night whenever this video reaches you. This has been Ruby, signing off.